Organizations usually have multiple environments. For example, they may have a staging environment and a production environment as well. In Azure App Services, we call them as deployment slots. So you will call the staging environment as a staging slot and a production environment as a production slot. Well, what are the advantages of having such slots? Well, if you have multiple environments, you can validate app changes in a staging environment slot before swapping it with a production slot. With that approach, you will have less complaints from your consumers. Deploying an application to a slot first and swapping it into production ensures that all instances of the slot are warmed up before being swapped into production. This will eliminate any downtime when you deploy your app. There's a wonderful option called as traffic redirection. This traffic redirection from prod to staging and staging to prod is also seamless, and no requests are dropped because of this swap operation. In production environments, you usually swap between staging and production to get the most current workloads delivered to your end users. The benefits of doing that is that if the changes swapped into a production slot are not as you expected, you can perform the same swap immediately to get back to your last known good site back. You can create a deployment slot from the app portal itself. So I'm here in the deployment slot section, and as you see, by default my web application is hosted into a production slot. At this moment, 100% of the traffic is going to this particular app. But then, like I said, you can create another slot by clicking on the add slot button, give it a name. Let's call it as staging. And then you have the options to clone the settings of this staging slot from the production slot. So I've selected creative apps here and I click on add. It will take a moment to replicate all the settings we have from the production slot to staging. But keep in mind that the new deployment slots can be empty as well. In this scenario, we have chosen to clone it, but you can always keep it empty. When you clone a configuration from another deployment slot, the cloned configuration is editable. So you can always go back and edit this configuration. All right, so now I have two apps. One is in production and the second one is staging. All right. But at this point, as you see, 100% of the traffic is going to production, but then you can always say that 70% goes to prod and then 30% goes to staging environment. By doing so, you will have less complaints coming from the website consumers. So if you're testing a particular web feature or a new service in your web application, then you may want to redirect the traffic and say, okay, 20% of the traffic now goes to my staging environment. All right, so I'll click on save here. Okay, so now my workloads are ready to go to staging as well. So that means that the 20% of the traffic will go to staging and 80% goes to prod. You might have already noticed that there's a swap button here. Once I click on swap, you got the options to swap between source and target. So when I do that, the content in my source will be synchronized to target, and the content in my target will then get synchronized to source. So there are certain settings as well that get swapped, and there are certain things and certain settings that do not get swapped. Let's talk about that for a minute. So there are certain settings that get swapped, and they are any framework related settings. Could be WebSockets, could be 32 or 64-bit related settings, any application settings, connection strings, handler mappings, any public certificates that you might have used, web job contents, hybrid connections to your on-premise, or you might have integrated with your virtual network, or even service endpoints. And if you have integrated with Azure CDN, the content delivery network, they will also get swapped. The settings that do not get swapped when you hit the swap button are any endpoints that you might have published or any custom domain names that are linked with your app service. Keep in mind that there are certain non-public certificates and TLS or SSL settings. They will also not get swapped. If you have done any auto scale related settings, web job schedulers, IP restrictions on your web application, always on features, diagnostic log settings of your web application, and cross origin resource sharing options for your web app will also not get swapped once you hit the swap button. Like you see, both of these deployment center and the deployment slots are very critical features for a developer to host an end-to-end continuous integration and continuous deployment for your web application. Like a cherry on the cake is the swap option where you can create multiple slots like production, staging, QA, and then redirect the traffic to those web applications appropriately. And once you hit the swap button, you will be able to make the configuration changes between the respective apps that you have. All right, that was a quick summary. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and learn how you can secure an app services and what options do we have inside the application to let you secure the tokens, manage the authenticated sessions, and how does identity information get handled inside an app service.